the goal of this game, if you haven't played a Scorched Earth clone type thing before, the game is each player controls a little tank. Worms is another game that is very, 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 very similar. Each player controls a tank or a worm or whatever it is on a sort of 2D map, generally speaking. People have tried to make like 3D versions of it. I mean, sometimes use a 3D engine, but still from like a 2D perspective. And 2D tends to just work better. On your turn, you can usually move your unit a little bit, but not much. And mostly what you're doing is you're choosing maybe from a range of different weapons. You're choosing an angle and usually some amount of power. And then you lob some artillery shell out somewhere, and you're trying to hit one of your opponents and it explodes there. A lot of those games also feature some amount of destructible terrain as well, which is a whole other topic of interesting stuff. We're going to be focusing on the first part of having each player have a unit that can move, shoot, take damage, blow each other up, and somehow, like, so it's going to be turn-based that way, and also presumably organized into rounds. You know, maybe we'll do like a kind of a last man standing kind of thing. So when we're down to one final player, that person is the winner. They score a point. Maybe you score points based on the order of your death or something like that, or maybe you score points for everyone you kill, and you get bonus points for being the last person standing. I kind of like that because it's conceivable for you to actually score more points but not be the last person standing. Imagine it's like a point per kill and 5 points for being the last person standing. If you're in a 10-player game and you're like a death machine, you could actually end up with more points than the person who ultimately survives if they just hid in a corner or something like that. I mean, all those things are up in the air and, you know, to be discussed and whatever, but it's an idea for implementation. I don't know actually how all those games tend to do it. Scorched Earth, I don't know if it kept score. I know you got money for doing things, and you could like buy weapons between rounds. I don't know how many of those other games do something like that. I haven't really played much in the way of Worms. I've never played Shell Shock. I've just watched Briarstone play it. So yeah, anyway. So we got all those sorts of mechanics in there. And after we do the core multiplayer part of like shooting, we're going to start with just like, I don't know, a flat surface. We will look into, as sort of like a second part of the tutorial, the idea of sort of destructible terrain and how we might want to make it work in something like this. Okay. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba-ba. Gorillas played it too. Well, like Gorilla, yeah, from the Q Basic game, yeah, it was just 2 players and you were lobbing bananas, right? Yeah, it was excellent. Okay, so let's get started and do very, 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 very quick and dirty basics for the setup. We will be doing lobby stuff, but we can throw that on after the fact. We will be starting with the built-in scripts with their crummy GUIs, and then we will be updating those later on. So, to get started, what we need is a single initial game object, which is going to be our network manager. And to have that work, now again, with Unity, you can work with like really low level, I mean, you can go right from like, you know, crafting your own packets if you want. Although the lowest practical level is probably working with their, was it LL API or something like that? Very, very low level networking API. We're going to use some of the more higher networking stuff, although some of it we will probably implement ourselves. Like for example, we may not use the built-in network transform, which is an interesting thing to consider. The other thing to worth noting is there's a fantastic project online, and I'll try to remember to include a link in the doobly-doo when I put this up on the YubTubs, which is basically a sort of a fixed or updated version by a third party for the Unity networking, and includes things like the networking transform script here, which is available. You can find all these on is it like GitHub that Unity maintains their files? You can actually look at the code all there directly in a much more convenient form. And it's huge. It's like, I don't know, a couple thousand lines long or something for some reason. Anyway, it's been rewritten to be like 200 lines long instead, and like much more efficient for a variety of ways. So we might not use the network transform directly. Anyway, right now, we're putting in the network manager script over here, and we're going to throw in as well the network manager hub. Again, both of these scripts, they don't do anything magical. These are all things you could absolutely write on your own. And in fact, we'll be doing some rewrite of some of these things down the road. But at this point, it means if we hit play, we can actually choose to host a game and connect to something. And we've got that done very easily for now. I'm going to go ahead and hit save. And I'm going to call this, I always, for some reason, name my scenes this way. That's just me. So this is going to be the gameplay scene. Okay? This is where we're actually going to play the game. What we're going to do later is we're going to create another scene, which is actually going to be the lobby connection scene, and then we'll be moving the network manager and doing a few things like that. But for now, it's going to be okay. All right. Let's set up the basic sort of view over here. We are going to, I'm just going to create a giant like rectangle for our ground for now. And later on, we'll be wanting to look into things like procedural terrain generation and also make it a destructible type terrain. But for now, all I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new empty. And inside of that empty, I'm going to go and put in a generic sort of sprite over here. This guy here, this is going to be our ground. And as per usual, I don't like to have the graphic object, i.e. the sprite, be my baseline object, because this gives you a lot more ability to sort of move things around and do things. Now, should this not show up as just a empty rectangle for me by default, even without a sprite? I thought it would just show up as a square, even without anything happening. Oh, there it is over there. No, it's gone. Really? Do I need at least a dummy rectangle? I thought it would just show up as just a white square if I didn't do anything. Oh, you know what I'm thinking? We can go over here, create a sprite. So I'm just going to create a dummy square sprite over here. So what this actually does is, like, literally creates an image for us in our project. So now what I can do is I can assign this square sprite to our ground, and then I can take this bad boy and stretch it in all kinds of different ways. So I think for simplicity, what I'll do is I'll keep my ground object at 0, 0, 0. And then what I'll do for the actual sprite is we're just going to scale it to be big enough to cover the camera for now. Clearly, we're going to want to work something out for the space. Maybe it's going to be a game where, like for something like Worms, for example, the map is fairly large, like fairly wide, and the camera can pan from side to side. So we're going to want to figure out something like that going forward, but for now, we're just going to make, some big old sprite over here. We're going to make it tall enough, again, to cover the camera, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring it down by half of its height. So there's going to be our ground plane over there. And we're going to want to figure out something way fancier later on, but for now, we're okay. Where's my drink? Now, one of the things that will change fairly dramatically when we go and implement our fancy schmancy ground is how do we detect if we're on the ground or not? Because right now, with the sprites, or just the fact that it's square and flat, we can just use the built-in Unity, like, 2D physics collision system and things like that to, like, keep things on there. But that's not actually, none of those tank-like games use your typical sort of, like, collider system for collision with the ground. For many, many, many different reasons. One of the big ones, though, is that the ground is really going to be irregular. It's going to need sort of pixel-perfect collision because, like, or pixel-based collision, because the ground itself later on will get deformed because you get an explosion and it blows away a chunk of ground. Even worse, you got some sort of cliffside, an explosion hits here, takes out a chunk, and then all the stuff that's above it would fall down, for example. And we're going to want to do something like that going forward. So right from the start, you got to think, we're not really going to use the Unity collision system. Now, that doesn't mean that we're not still going to have a collider on our tanks. The colliders for the tanks are still going to be useful for figuring out maybe if you get shot or not, that sort of thing. Although they are, you can expect that they're going to be probably kinematic rigid bodies. We're not going to use a physics system to move around. Instead, what we're probably going to do is, I suspect, and I don't know, I'd have to go through and test all these different games and compare and contrast, but I think what we'll ultimately do is we will check the 1 pixel underneath the midpoint of our tank. I think that's what we'll level our tank based off of. Because I think in these games, if you're in a situation, I need some objects. There we go. If you're in a situation, I got some Dutch chocolate here, and you're on a steep sort of slope, right? This is the cliffside, a steep sort of slope, and this is your tank. I think it's basically the midpoint of the tank sort of sits like this. Certainly in these games, I don't think it tends to be physicsy where you hit here and the tank sort of like falls over, although maybe it does. I don't know. I think a lot of them, they tend to mostly be... Oh, I didn't realize this was like invisibility mode. I need a better object. Oh, hold on. I got a USB key. So I don't think they'd fall and sort of flip like this. Or do they? I mean, we could. There's nothing stopping us from doing that. But I think, especially in Scorched Earth, because it was very old school, what would happen is you would sort of fall like this. And I mean, you think of it as like you're just in front of some part of the hill. It's okay. It doesn't look like... I mean, does it look like you're penetrating into the hill? Maybe. Although that's part of the reason why most of the weapons are AoE. Even a tiny little AoE as opposed to direct fire. So even if you hit the hill just on top of the tank, you would still end up doing damage to the tank. So I think that's what we will end up doing, is something like that. Looking vertices, take their angles. Tank's angle to the ground is going to be the same. And I mean, we can. The nice thing is, what we can do going forward is we can make all kinds of changes to that. I think the base effect in terms of where the tank is going to be positioned vertically is going to be based at looking at the midpoint of the tank and finding the pixel that it hits, and it's going to rest the tank there. We can then decide to adjust the tank to sit it sideways based on sort of the normal of the slope through different calculations later on, just to be more visually appealing. But let's leave that until later. Okay. That's a lot of prep talk for some concepts that have nothing to do with multiplayer or anything like that, but we gotta get some of these ideas in our head. Let's get an tank in the scene. So we're gonna create another empty, and we're gonna call this something like player tank. I mean, I guess just tank is fine. They're all gonna be player tanks. I mean, some might be AI players, some might be the local players, some might be network players, but they're all gonna be tanks, so that's gonna be okay. And then inside of that, I will add a sprite. So what I'm going to do is, so this is the Kenny files. Now, some of them, there's a bunch of stuff, including bullets over here. It's these sort of tanks here, but I don't want the full constructed tank because I want to have a turret that will swivel at different angles over here. So, oh yeah, this, I guess if we have the body, then it separates out the tracks. Okay, that's going to be fine. So we're going to put in the tank body. We're going to put in some tank tracks, which we'll want to overlap on top of the body, and the tank turret, which again come in different styles. We'll just start with turret 1. That's going to be okay, except that I failed to actually drag it onto things. Okay, let's zoom way in over here. And so first of all, we're going to want some sort of layering over here. Now, by default, you can layer things by messing with the Z position of things in 2D. It's not really the ideal way of doing it. The better way to do it is probably to use the sorting layers over here. The sorting layers determines the order at which sprites are drawn. So what we can do is we can do something like have a sorting layer for the ground, have another one for the tanks, and probably something else for, like, bullets. Because I suspect you're going to want the bullets in front of the tanks, maybe. It might not apply for the turret. No, this is going to be fine. So we'll probably switch this around. I don't know what will be on the default layer, if anything. I guess I'll put the default layer on top of everything else. So that way, if we forget to set a sorting layer for something, it'll at least be visible, and we might, like, change that. But the ground will be in the background. Then the tanks, and then the bullets on top of all that. And probably explosions will be part of the bullet layer or something. So we're going to take all the tank parts and give them a sorting layer of tank. And then we're going to take the ground over here, and we're going to give it a sorting layer of ground. Now, all of a sudden, the tank is in front, which is great. Now, the base game object for the tank is at 0, 0, 0. It's at this point right over here. And I think I want that point to effectively be the point of contact with the ground. So that's the advantage of having your sprites inside of your base object, because then what you can do is you can raise the things up over here. I'm going to take the tracks, and I'm going to line up the tracks so that the bottom of the tracks are... Actually, that's a good question. Like, we can get it to be lined up basically right with the ground, but I might go and have the bottom of the track be slightly into the ground like this. Maybe even a little bit more. I like it. It gives it just the slightest 3D effect over here, especially if I get the turret out of the way. Like, it overlaps the ground just a scooch, and I think that'll look good. It's certainly a lot better than having your tank look like it's floating a pixel above the ground. So this gives us a little bit more overlap. And then the question becomes, where do we actually put the body? You know, do we want to overlap the tracks a lot? Do we want the tracks to be on top of the body? I can see arguments for both ways. Oh, that's interesting. It doesn't actually use this. Huh. Now, I don't think that looks as good. And really, the tracks should be protected slightly. I think we want it to sit high enough so that you can see the sort of, like, axles of the tracks. Something like that. And I guess for the turret, what I will do is actually, I'll make another sorting layer for the turret, which goes behind the tanks. Like that. And set it somewhere over here. Now, one of the things we're going to want to do with the turret is we're going to want to rotate this. And the thing is, we don't want the turret to rotate along the midpoint. And there's a couple of different ways to change this. I'm going to go, and again, just to make it a little easier and more future-proofy, I'm going to go and add a new empty. I'm going to put the turret inside of that. And the midpoint of the game object, I want the midpoint of the game object to sort of be at the rotation point, which I'm going to call somewhere around here. And then the turret graphic itself, I mean, we could align things. So now, if I take this object and rotate it through the Z-axis, there you go. We got the turret this way. And you can aim in any direction. Backwards looks a little funky. I'm wondering if I should move you somewhere more like this. Then how does that look if we rotate around? I think that's pretty good. Seems okay? Seems okay. Can make the body of the tank bob up and down over the wheels. Oh, that's an excellent idea. And yeah, there was no reason we couldn't. So I guess you'd want the turret to bob up and down a little bit as well, without affecting the physics of it. We can definitely look into doing something like that. We can add a little bit of a bob to part of the body, or part of the wheels. Like, depending on, like, when you're standing still, maybe nothing happens, and when you're moving, maybe there should be some bobbing around. We'll see. You want the sprites to be pixel perfect? I mean, we may make some of those adjustments later on. We will see. How do you show the X, Y arrow for moving a game object? So, by default, when you are working with sprites, I think it wants to use the rect transform. There's also the, yeah, I think it might want to use the rect transform over here. I'm not sure. But you can just go back over to the normal transform tool over here. Feels like it's a bit high on his wheels. Yeah, I also think that. Also, the blue background is not doing us a whole heckin' lot of favors over here. So, oh, there's a big explosion coming in. Didn't realize my volume was set so high. It's Tasty Sauerkraut, and I do love sauerkraut. Thank you very much, Tasty. The ghost of Spymaster Tasty Sauerkraut Anonymous returns to haunt you. There was a disease in Constantinople. I always enjoy programming streams. Thank you. Yeah. When you send your spy somewhere where there's an active disease, it tends to be kind of bad for your Spymaster. I'm terribly sorry if you did suffer a premature death over in our Crusader Kings 2 series, but thank you very much, Tasty Sauerkraut, for that very generous support. Oh, yeah, I like the programming streams too. So, one thing we can do is, well, we can just change some of the colors of the bodies. Like, ooh, the desert pattern, things like that. The other thing I like to do is if you have a sprite... Oops, that's a full one. That's not the body. If you have a... oh, they actually painted them in different shapes. If you have a sprite that is like white or grayscale, it's really easy to throw a tint in there. Yeah, so we got a bunch of different shapes, too, we can use. They look kind of funky. Yeah, but the nice thing about the gray one, so yeah, you can go and give it a tint. So different players end up with different colors. Oh, well, we'll just leave it as the default here for now. That's going to be okay. And what we probably want to do is also plan on having a little name tag above people's heads over here. I should really bring in the the fancy what you call it, the text mesh add-on that was bought by Unity for that. But let's leave it be for now. All right, so we have some sort of object over here. We're going to turn this into a prefab. So this is our tank prefab over here. We can delete the in-game version. Now, because this is an object that is going to be synchronized and discussed in some way on the network, this object will need a player identity. The way a player identity is, if you were to write this code yourself, basically, you just give each one of your objects that are activated on the network a number, like based on the order they spawn in. So the first one would be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So when you send a signal and you say, this particular object needs to move 3 pixels to the left, you say, object with the network ID 5 needs to move 3 pixels to the left. Because there's no other way to reference the same object. You need to have some sort of shared identifier that all the computers agree that, okay, object 5 is this one over here. So that is what a network identity does. And it also does a little bit more work for us automatically, so that's good. Now, one of the things we are missing for making our game active on the network, there's 2 things we need. First, we do need a player prefab, but also anything that can be spawned in-game needs to be registered as a spawnable prefab, because again, this is a numeric ID. So if I drag the tank into the spawnable prefab over here, now every client, everyone connected to the game knows if I get a signal that says, hey, spawn prefab number 4, we will know what prefab number 4 is, because again, we can't just point to something in the project. We need to have some other sort of set of identifiers. So this way, everyone connected to the game knows that there's these 30 different objects that can be spawned on the network, and if you get told to spawn object 18, it means I spawn this particular thing over there. And yes, now we also need to spawn a player prefab, because the way the default network manager is set up is that when someone connects, the network manager spawns a particular object for that player. Again, there's nothing particular we need. Like there's no innate reason why something like that needs to exist in your networked game. You need to keep track of the fact that there are players connected to the game in some way, and there's a number of different ways the networking system keeps track of who's connected to the game, but it's very convenient from a high level to just say, listen, for each player that connects, spawn this little object for them, and we're going to use that to manage the player. Now, in the built-in Unity tutorial that they have on their website, you would be spawning, say, the tank as the player prefab, but in our tutorial, I've made a case for why it's very nice not to have the player prefab be something that's actually visible in the game. And the reason for that is, if a tank gets destroyed, what does that mean for the player? So instead, we keep this invisible player prefab that's in there that keeps track of the player's score and any money they've accrued and weapons they've unlocked or whatever mechanics are appropriate for the game. So even when the tank gets destroyed, it's okay. At some point, the round will start or some other mechanic will cause the player to respawn or whatever it is, and then we just spawn them a new tank while keeping their player object around all the time. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new empty, and the network manager refers to this thing as a player prefab, so we'll just call it a player prefab. Like, literally call it the whole object. Now, again, this is something that might be shared on the network, so it'll probably need a network ID. And I believe that's all that's required, is a player ID. And technically, I always figured you would need to turn on the local player authority for this object, but instead it gets flagged as the actual player-owned object, which implicitly gives it local player authority, whether or not you click this checkmark on. We'll be talking about this checkmark a little bit more in relation to this tank a little bit later. So we'll make this as a prefab, and we'll drop this into the network manager player prefab over here. So now, if we run the game at this point, and because we have the built-in network manager GUI, which is intentionally ugly and we want to change, and we can run ourselves as a server-only mode, we can also connect to any server that's running. If we hit host, what it does is it starts this computer or this particular copy of the game in server mode and then connects to itself instantly. Boom. So now if we do that, we are now both the server and the client. The network manager by default makes itself set to don't destroy unload, which is great. Although, again, when we get to multiple scenes and things like that, we're going to have to discuss certain possible side effects of this. Because we have connected, the network manager automatically spawned a player prefab for us, so now we have this identity in the game. Okay, good. So, the player prefab, when it gets spawned, we're going to go ahead and give it a script. I might just call it the player prefab script. I guess that's fine. I mean, I guess I could just call it player script. Sure, player script. The player script goes on the player prefab. I could just call it player. Names are important because they help keep you organized. Having the word script in there, I guess, is redundant. So we'll just call it player. And if I hit enter right now, it'll want to make a network lobby player, which isn't what I want. So create an ad. All right, we're going to call it player. And this was added to the player prefab. So now we have our first script in the game. The prefab 4. Paul, John, George, and Ringo. Nice. Ba-da-da-da-da. Okay. Embiggen. Lovely. So here is our script. Now, to be network aware, what we want to do is, instead of being derived from mono behavior, we want it to be derived from network behavior, which itself is derived from mono behavior. By doing this, unity engine.network king, by doing this, we have a script that can access the network stuff. Other than that, it's exactly the same as every mono behavior component you've ever done. It's just that it has some extra references in here that means we can do networky kind of things and think about that. So, this script represents a connected player who might own, I'm putting that in quotes because the degree at which we own objects in a multiplayer setting is kind of fuzzy, right? In terms of, yeah, okay, this tank represents my unit, but do I own it directly? Or do I have to tell the server what I would like to do with this object? Because there might be different amounts of authority depending on, you know, how cheat resistant you want to be or whatever. Who might own other objects in the game. Okay? So we can still use start for initialization because when we connect to the server, it'll spawn this object, and then before update gets called for the first time, start will run. So that's quite cool. Let's assume that what we're going to do when we connect in, let's assume that we are going to want to spawn a tank, but really we're going to want to spawn a tank when a new round starts, aren't we? Sounds like at this point we need some sort of game manager kind of object, doesn't it? To say when the round starts, as opposed to instantly spawning everything. You know, we let everyone connect, and then it goes 3, 2, 1, and spawns a bunch of, like, every player spawns a tank. I think that's pretty legit. Unity will soon discontinue support for mono-develop. You should switch to Visual Studio. And I'm very pleased about that. But right now I'm just continuing to use the default setup in Unity because it's best for tutorial-y kind of things. So, does a player actually need access to the tank pre-spawn or prefab? I guess it depends. Who's responsible for spawning the tank for the players? Is the player responsible for spawning the tank, or is the game manager responsible for spawning a tank for each player? I think it's kind of one of these 6 of one, half dozen of the other things. I kind of like the idea, I think, of the player being responsible for spawning the tank. So we'll have some sort of public void spawn tank. This gets called by the game manager when a new round starts, and a player needs a tank. So if we're going to do that, then we're going to want some sort of public prefab, public game object, wow, tank prefab. You know, which presumably over here, right, to do, this player might have a favorite color, so consider customizing their tank. Color/logo, like, you know, consider this, right? So you start up the game for the first time, you go into your options, and you tell the game, you pick a logo and a color, and all these sorts of things. Also, username? you know, these are all things we can tune. And so I think at this point, yeah, I like the idea of making the player responsible for spawning and customizing his old tank. I like it. Okay. So we've got that. There's some logic that's going to go into the player. So now let's go and add some logic to our game manager over here, right? Our network manager has the built-in network manager script, which is okay. Let's add, how about a game manager script on this guy? Chugga, chugga, chugga. Chugga, chugga, chugga. Are you... Did you open? There we go. Yeah, we're not really going to cry when monodevelop goes away. Unity engine.networking. Boom. And network behavior. So, the job of this, now remember, Game Manager is going to be spawned as soon as you go into sort of like the multiplayer menu, because it's part of the same network manager object. So, we may not want to do anything in start. Note, start runs even before anyone connects to any server. At this point, we don't even know if we are going to just be a client or if we're going to be the actual server object. So there's things to consider there. Now, there are a variety of events that we can respond to, and hopefully I will do this correctly. What order, which one do we want, actually? I suppose if we have, we might want to implement the lobby mode right from the start. Because by the nature of this, we don't want any gameplay until everyone is connected, has marked themselves as ready, do we? Right? It's not like a first-person shooter where people can just drop in and out of the world. Although, I suppose it could. You know what? Okay. Our first implementation, because I want to kind of partition the lobby work off, right? The sort of matchmaking lobby, create a game, have people connect, hit ready, and then it starts all at once. We're going to go, and I want to partition that off and do that next step. So the way it's going to work, actually, is when you spawn in, you get a tank right away. And then you respawn after 10 seconds. That's going to be our first pass at this. Very, very dead simple. Okay, we'll keep the game manager script there for now, but we're going to come back over here instead. So the behavior that we're going to do is going to be this. Make it so if a player spawns inside another, the original player explodes. Oh, that's rude. I love it. So, for now, we're going to spawn a player's tank as soon as they connect. And when a player dies, they will respawn probably in just like 3 seconds. Even 3 seconds feels like forever. In 3 seconds. So it's more like a tank deathmatch. So you get crew points probably by killing people over and over. And maybe, you know, we could just have the room time out after like a minute. That's actually not too terrible. Right? So as the server, the initial game manager pass is going to be something like... So float the time left, which is going to start at something like, I don't know, 3 minutes. Okay? For now, we just reset the room, well, the map, / players every 3 minutes, or however many that is. So time left minus equal time.delta time. If time left is less than or equal to 0, then restart the match. Whatever that means. There we go. So this will be a good way to start off, and, you know, just be able to test and make things work. Now, what we have to remember at this point, and this is one of the things that's kind of hard to keep track of in multiplayer, this game manager script technically exists on every single person's computer. every person has this network manager script over here, and this network manager has this game manager script on it. So it's running for absolutely everyone at the same time. Is that what we want? I mean, probably not. What about time right? Boom. So there's a bunch of different ways to do it. For now, we're going to assume maybe the game manager is something that's supposed to be running on everyone's side, because maybe the game manager on the client syncs to the game manager on the server, and the game manager is responsible for, like, keeping up the UI, right? Like, on each player, we're probably going to want a timer in the top right corner, and the timer tells you how much time is left. And the timer gets that number from the game manager. It asks the game manager, hey, how much time is left? Heck, we'll make it public, right? So that means we want this value to be available on every single client. So even a client will have a copy of Game Manager, but the important thing is that the ones on the client, as opposed to the server, shouldn't update anything on themselves. In fact, I'm going to suggest that time left should be a sync var. Now, a sync var is a value that if you change this on the server, it will then automatically be sent to all of the clients. Now, in the tutorial, I made the argument that effectively you could do the same thing with, like, RPC calls or whatever. Sync var does try to be a little bit more efficient in terms of, like, packing together a bunch of data in as small of a packet as possible, so there is a win to using a sync var. So now, if we change time left on the server, it will then change on other clients. Technically, any client can modify the number in time left, which will affect their own view of time left, but that doesn't get copied to anyone else. So, I mean, they can change their own version of this number, but it's going to have no real effect. So now all of a sudden, we need to fix this, and we only want to make this change here on the server. So probably when we want to do something is if is server is equal to false. So is server is something that we have access to because we're derived from network behavior. If server is equal to false, and yes, I can do the exclamation mark thing, but especially in tutorials, I like to be super explicit. An exclamation mark is easy to miss. An equals false is really freaking clear. We are not the server, so we're just going to bail out of the update. Now, maybe there's some stuff that we're going to want to update on the client side as well, in which case we do it above this. And maybe we'd split it up, right? We then have two functions we call client update, server update. We could do something like that. But this is going to be good enough for now. So now, the time left only gets modified if we're actually on the server. And it will get updated over here. One of the nice things about sync var as well is by default, the server, or the whole networking system, tries to send an update no more than once every 10 milliseconds, because with latency and things like that, there's sort of no point. And the networking system is smart enough that it sort of grabs all of the possible, like, updates and things, and then tries to, like, pack them efficiently into as few packets as possible, so every 10 milliseconds. And the thing about the sync var is every time you change something that's a sync var, assuming I've understood all the documentation correctly, it doesn't actually spam a network update every single time, which is important because this update function, this technically runs once per frame, not once per every physics tick or anything like that. So if you turn off vsync and you have a really fast computer, this could run 1,000 times a second or something crazy. And you don't want to spam 1,000 packets per second. Instead, I believe part of the sync var mechanic is every time it does one of those network updates, like every 10 seconds, it just checks to see, it just checks all the sync vars and just say, hey, has this value changed from what it was before? Is it dirty? Yes? Okay, then I'll send it. So even if you make like 20 changes to time left, it's only going to send that change every 10 milliseconds. And so it's a lot less spammy than using an RPC. So that should be okay to do this in real time and do that. So every client will automatically update time left. If for some reason you want to be able to respond to the change of time left, you can hook this. Again, I always like screw up the syntax, but it's something like this, and then you put in some function name, and then that function will be called from the hook. I might be a little bit wrong about the syntax. I always have to double check it, but anyway, good enough for now. All right, so now we have a timer that counts down. Okay. I guess we could go ahead and display it. Sure. You know what? If it exists, let's make it happen. So, create. we are going to create under UI some sort of text thing, which automatically creates the canvas and the event system for it. So this text thing is simply going to be the countdown timer. And I'm just going to go and holding Alt and Shift, I'm going to shove it into the top right corner. I am going to get it to be right aligned. I am going to embiggen the font to 28. It then disappears because our height isn't sufficient enough to actually fit the object in there. There we go. So now it's in there. We are going to give it a little bit of spacing from the left, -4, and from the top. This is still the build where tabbing doesn't adjust things. Oh, that wants to be a negative as well. Obviously, the coloring is impossible to read over here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the color to white, and then I'm going to add a component on this. I'm going to add the outline component. It's a nice little trick. So this will give us a black outline around the text. It might not quite show up on YouTube, but it definitely pops nicely here. We can make it a little bit bigger with the outline. Oh, yeah, really, God. But you know what? The 1-1 looked pretty good. It's just enough. What you want is a different colored outline from your text, because if this ends up being on a white background, you won't be able to see the white text, but then you'll still see the black outline, so you'll still be able to read it either way. So this could be said to be the final countdown. God damn it. Now that's in everyone's head, Zervin. Ugh, you're terrible. So now the only question is, who's responsible for updating the countdown timer? There's two ways to do it. Either in our game manager, we could add a reference to the countdown timer, and it'll be responsible for updating that. But what if we change the way the UI works and all kinds of different things? Game manager has to be updated every time, and it's going to be responsible for doing a lot of work. I think that's crazy. I think the much better way of doing it is for the countdown timer to be responsible for updating its own number. So we'll go ahead and give it a little script. And I really like when something's just a UI component script, I like to put in the word UI in here because it reminds me when I'm looking through all the scripts that this isn't a script that's supposed to do anything. It's mostly just reading things, or possibly it responds to a button click and then triggers something on some other objects. I really like to have, and this is part of my web developer days, like to have that segregation in web programming you tend to see MVC, model view component. But especially here, the segregation between your game logic and your user interface logic. User interface doesn't change anything in the game. It just reads things from the game logic or sends a signal to the game logic and tells it to do something. That way you can completely wipe out the UI and redesign it without breaking your game, in theory. You know, in a perfect world. Reed hands everyone a rubber duck to talk to, almost in the same manner that Quillatine is talking to chat. Rubber duck debugging is an extremely powerful thing. And really, talking about your problems, like in programming, lets you sort of visualize and sort it out. The idea is, talk to a rubber duck, or you can use someone as a rubber duck, and assume they know nothing about your project and just work it through. So the countdown timer UI will need to have a reference to the game manager. Okay? We need to know who our game manager is so that we can read data from it. And we're just going to do the typical thing where we are simply going to find object by type. And we're just going to ask Unity, hey, find us an object in the game that has a component on it of type game manager. Technically, if there was more than one, things could go weird. If there was none, things would go weird. You can check it here, or you can just wait until update throws some sort of error. If there's more than one, it just returns the first one it finds. And, you know, different game programming patterns. This is an excellent book, by the way. Where's my webcam? Right over here. Game programming patterns. In terms of, like, you know, managers and singletons and service providers and things like that. There's different ways to think about this. And, you know, there's potential issues, but most of the time it's pretty goddamn clean and good. So we're just going to cache a copy, because in a sense, this is a slightly slow operation. You don't want to do that every frame. And every frame we'll just say, okay, and we also want to keep track of our text. So we have a text component on the game timer UI object that we are. This is part of the UI namespace. So we're going to want text, my text. Actually, normally I just call it text like that. That's going to be fine. So text is equal to get component. We could do get component in children as well, because it does check ourselves. But we'll do this. On our object, we have some sort of text component. And so on every update, we're simply going to go and set text.text to be equal to game manager dot time left. we probably want to go and format that, and I can never remember how to format decimals to 2 freaking points, because it's with the string format. I never remember the magic words, even though it's actually built in here if you use the right one. C#, 2 decimal places. I never remember. 2 string, and then there we go. That's the sort of thing I'm looking for. So number dot number number. Oops. Number dot number number. Do something like that. Hopefully that's the right one. I'm so bad at this. So if we play, technically this will start counting down right away. No, it won't, because we're not a server. Also, there's no network ID on what object? On the network manager? On the player prefab? On the tank? Do I need a network ID on the network manager? Right, yes I do. This is going to be object 0. We weren't... Oh, and now I don't have a link to the tank, I think, is the error. Network manager has a network ID component. This will cause it to be disabled. Okay, so note. Oh, hold on. Right. That's what the problem is. So the game manager script is derived from network behavior. You're only allowed to do a deriving from network behavior if your object has a network ID on it. But the network manager shouldn't have a network ID. So what we're going to have to do is split the game manager onto its own object. Assuming I'm remembering this correctly, that's what the issue is. So I'm going to remove the game manager. Now I can remove the network identity from here. Excellent. And the game manager over here, we're going to put the script there. And it automatically added the network identity for us. Okay, yes. I mean, there's still going to be an issue because it's going to be our player prefab over here is trying to spawn itself a tank. So that's one. Well, actually, no. There's something else going on. Okay. Null value is found. On number 19. Did you not actually find your game manager? Oh, because you start disabled. Oh, that's right. Okay, I think I've got this. So, let's do a little check here. If game manager equals null, why didn't we find our game manager? Pretty sure I got this. You learn by doing mistakes and spotting them. So, we're going to run. We're getting a bunch of errors. I'm just going to pause here for a second and scroll up. Why didn't we find our game manager? And that's what we're getting the errors here. It's because it's trying to access the game manager to get the countdown, and it's not getting it. Well, we didn't find it because it's actually disabled. Yeah, let's not get into a discussion about singletons. For a variety of different reasons. The game manager is disabled because, by default, with the Unity network system, the way that it's implemented in the high-level stuff, is anything with a network identity is disabled until the game is started, until you've connected to a server or you yourself are a server. If I go on and pause it, if I go to LAN host over here, so now I'm a server that's connected to itself, you can see the game manager is no longer disabled. It's now running with the time left. Now, as a side effect of this, you cannot find an object for something that's been disabled. It's simply not searched for. Disabled objects are not found. So what we have to do here is we can change things up. And instead, in our update, like there's a couple of different things we could do. We could keep a permanent link to it, but I like it I'm really keen on objects that find their own parts. If you're having to keep a bunch of links maintained in your little inspector window, it's ripe for things breaking. So I like when things find themselves. So instead we do an if game manager is equal to null. Then first what we're going to do is we're going to try to find it. And then if game manager is still equal to null, then we're going to say the game probably hasn't started yet, and we'll just return. Now, there's other things we could do in terms of, like, listening for events to fire or something like that. This little sort of more or less null loop with a little find, I mean, this, again, it could be slightly slow, but this is happening before the game starts, so it's not going to be a problem. Singleton, your chat's more likely than you think. So, like, there's people that singletons are a design pattern that were developed to try to resolve certain problems with, like, global variables and things like that, and ended up causing quite a lot more problems. I'm not going to say they're, like, wrong in every situation, but if you're fresh out of university, or, you know, you learn sort of that pattern in university and just sort of stuck with it, it's not necessarily... It's like how people used to be like, well, why don't you use inheritance for everything? And it turns out that, like, component-oriented design is really nice. There we go. So now we're running here. That is a little twitchy, and that's because we're not using a fixed width font. And our alignment is a little bit wonky. That's what's happening here, is just it's changing its alignment just a little bit, I think, with some of the numbers. But that's easy to fix by just placing it differently or formatting things differently. Actually, we probably don't need the decimals. Well, I don't know. I kind of like the decimals. Maybe just one decimal is going to be fine. Just from a visual point of view, you know what I mean? Like, this is the least important thing. Use 0.00. Oh, because it'll keep the extra character in. You're right. That's what's happening. Yes, thank you very much. Because it's when it's a 0, it's not putting it there. We can force the 0 to be there. So maybe with 2 zeros is still going to be fine because it'll look cool. Since we're using Arial by default and it's not fixed width, there might still be some twitchiness. No? Is it fixed width? Are all the numbers the same width, maybe? Because it is a variable width font, but maybe all the numbers use the same width. Whatever. All right, excellent. So that's now counting down when we're connected, and that's great. So that'll work on every single client. It should anyway. We'll test it later, but it should work on every client. Right now, we're acting as both the server and the client. So our game manager is the proper one belonging to the server. We could force it to only exist on the server by doing this. But again, I like the idea of this existing on the client because it can keep track of some of the numbers for us. It helps us sync our game manager data. What's next? Well, do we spawn tanks and stuff? No, we spawn the player prefab, and it knows about the tank thing, but never gets... It never actually does it, right? Yeah. So we want to actually call spawn tank. Boop, boop, boop. Done. Okay. Data class is more akin to namespaces. They don't have objects. They're not constructed. That's true. Although you can have a constructor for you can have a static constructor for a static class to initiate your or initialize your static like member variables. I mean, it's not truly the same as a constructor, but because they're not instantiated, but still. Okay, so we are now going to go and spawn. Now, at this point, we have to be very aware of who's going to be running the various code over here, right? So the question is, spawn tank, this function, does it get run by the player or the server, and who should run it? Now, here's the thing to note. If I go and instantiate an object, okay, let's say I say something like, so to instantiate an object, you just do this, tank prefab, right? I have now created an object. And in fact, if I run this, we will now see a tank in the game. The problem is this. Instantiate only creates the object on the local computer. It is not sent to anyone else on the in the game. So whether a client creates it or whether the server creates it, it doesn't matter. It doesn't get shared in any way whatsoever. Now, this is still good because there's lots of objects that you're going to want to create that don't have to exist on the network. I've talked about it before, all kinds of special effects with explosions. Maybe you tell the clients, hey, make an explosion over here, and every client just like spawns its own explosion graphic or something, but those explosions aren't synced in any way on the network because, you know, they're just a visual effect, so there's no reason to use any bandwidth for it. The way to tell everyone to spawn the object in a network-linked fashion is this. Network server, that should be a hint about something, dot spawn, and then you pass it the game object. Now, this has to be something that's already been instantiated, so what we need to do is a game object, geo equals this, and then we spawn like that. So this will do is it will tell all the clients in the game to go into their list, because this is going to be referenced based on the network manager. Oh my god, my eye. The network manager's list of spawnable prefab. It's going to say, all right, everyone spawn prefab number 18 or whatever it is, like that. And it will spawn prefab number 18 and give it network ID 9001, for example. And then you can refer to the same object later on by saying, hey, the object with ID 9001 has moved 2 pixels to the right, for example. So that does that. But, as should be obvious, only the network server can initiate the spawn command. So spawn tank, even though I'm saying each player script is going to be responsible for running it, it can only run on the server. Now, this player script is on the player prefab object, and the player prefab object is going to be instantiated / spawned on the server and on every single client. It's going to exist everywhere. So this script here can run on the server, and that's perfectly okay. So we want to put in a little check here. If is server equals false, we want to say something like spawn tank can only do what it's supposed to from the server. So we'll return here, but if we're calling this from a client, then we really do want to spam an error out because, like, we've called this inappropriately. I mean, the right thing to do is to do nothing, but the righter thing to do is to never actually accidentally call this on the client because some sort of logic failure happened somewhere along the way, and you're probably thinking about your code wrong somewhere. So we'll put a nice big error in there so that we're aware of it. So now we're at the state where, okay, we're only running this if we're existing on the server, we're instantiating the game object, and then telling everyone to spawn it. So that should work. Now, the game manager, when is it actually going to do this? Well, again, I was saying the player here can spawn the tank, but again, this should only be true from the server's point of view. All right, when a player dies, it will spawn in 3 seconds. So, again, this is going to have to be moved. Probably to the game manager, which responds to, like, on-player connect events. Or something. But let's hold off here. So, if is server, and again, I'm going to explicitly say is equal to true. Spawn tank. Okay, let's give that a try. It could be a command, and that's entirely a way to go, when we're going to talk about that in a bit. The question is the client going to be responsible for sending a command to the server to spawn things? That's something for discussion. Maybe, maybe not. I guess it comes down to, are you going to wait for some sort of user input to respawn? Right? Is it the sort of game where it says you're dead, it's got a countdown, and when it's done the countdown, you can hit spacebar to respawn? In which case, a server command makes perfect sense. But there is an inherent difference to some function that's really only going to run on the server and something that's going to run as per a command on the server. So, thank you to all the January Patreon supporters and these Mic Check supporters. Yukofin, Lurking Ninja, Dubiouser Curl, Tiburon, Mighty Mix, Pavel Zdanov, Adam Keenan, Michael McClintock, Aaron Dobson, Rarskal, Gurko Dries, Jesper Bisgard, Julien Gelafon, Soren Tried Anderson, Marisfield Vold, Speedy Savant, Steven Stager, Thomas Oberson, Jason Yanity, Easter Egg Productions, Neil Blakey, Milner, and everyone who watched, shared, favorited, and subscribed. Thank you so very much.